Okay, welcome everybody. If you're here to learn a bit about the fundamentals of business case development, then you're in the right place. My name's Andrew Laird and I'm the Managing Director of Mutual Ventures, and I'm joined by my Mutual Ventures colleagues, Mark Bandali and Paul Clark. Mark, Paul, do you want to just quickly say hello?
Hello, everyone.
Morning.
Great. So the requirement for developing business cases for councils, I feel, has increased over the past few years, particularly for district councils, where Levelling Up Funding, Shared Prosperity Fund, Rural England Prosperity Funding, all requires the development of business cases and plans in order to both bid for the funding, but also make decisions locally about what you're actually going to do with it. So quite a lot of you probably listening will have submitted plans at a high level, presumably for things like the Shared Prosperity Fund. But now that funding is starting to come through, you need to take those plans to the next level. And we're going to get into all of that today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This is being recorded, so you can take notes if you want, obviously, but the recording will be sent out to everybody afterwards. If you have any questions for the three of us during the session, you can use the Q&A function along the bottom of the Zoom panel and submit your questions there. You won't be able to ask them directly because there are quite a few people on, and it would be a little bit chaotic, I think. So that's a better way of managing it. And then at the end, we will also send out the Mutual Ventures business case development guide. So just a little bit of background on business cases. So the public sector gold standard for business cases is the Treasury 5-case Green Book model. The way that's structured is in 5 cases. So there is a strategic case, which is where you make the case for change and how whatever you're proposing fits more broadly with what you're doing. There's the economic case, which is all about demonstrating value for money. There's the finance case, which demonstrates that what you're proposing is affordable and at what point costs will be incurred. There's the commercial case, which is the practical case. How will you do it? Is it viable commercially? And if you need a procurement route, what is that? And then finally, there's the management case, which essentially proves that it can be delivered. Do you have the right people in place with the right skills? What are the timelines? What are the dependencies, etc.? But before getting into what the business case actually is, we need to just have a shared understanding of what exactly a business case is for. And this is all about what you're actually testing. So I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to talk us through some of the principles of doing a theory of change and developing propositions which your business case will test. Mark.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everyone. So building on what Andrew just said, that there are some important stages before you sort of put pen to paper on the business case. These are extremely helpful, but not essential. But we would strongly recommend that those looking to undertake a business case start with a theory of change. It's something many of you may recognise. Ultimately, it's an important first step in the process, and the purpose really is to identify on the one hand what problems you're trying to solve and what the challenges are, and on the other hand identify what good looks like if an intervention were implemented to achieve those benefits. So this is as much about a logic test as anything. So on the left-hand side of a theory of change, you'd identify those challenges and those market failures that are being experienced, ultimately describing and defining the problem that needs to be solved. Importantly, also to understand and identify the impact that these challenges are having on, for example, residents, communities, businesses, third sector organisations and other stakeholders, for example. So really defining the problem and the case for change. And on the right-hand side of the theory of change is what good looks like. So if one or more interventions were effective, what would be the benefits? So you could break those down by outputs, outcomes, longer term impacts, and also identify the measures and metrics that would be used to identify both the baseline, but also how effective the intervention has been. So you have a theory of change on two sides, that one side the problem, on the other side what good looks like. And the logic test comes in the middle bit. So if you are proposing a particular intervention, it's a really helpful logic test. You put that intervention or a series of interventions, say through a long list, and you can test through a collaborative approach with your stakeholders, for example, how well each of these interventions will address both the market failures or the challenges and result in those benefits that you're looking to realize. So the theory of change process is incredibly helpful. It helps, it can be collaborative. It can involve some service redesign if the interventions that you had in mind aren't absolutely perfect or won't achieve the benefits or address the challenges. But it's an important stage in the process, and it lays the basis, the effective basis for a business case, and specifically the strategic case, which I know Andrew's going to talk about in a bit. So if we take that a step further, you've completed the theory of change, and the middle bit of the theory of change, you've identified the interventions. We think that there's a really strong case for developing what we term as propositions, and propositions ultimately just a tangible description of the interventions you're proposing. So the benefits are it gets everyone on the same page. Everyone's talking about the same thing when they're talking about a intervention. It allows for further co-design. Many of you might do this through an options appraisal or another form of sort of development. But ultimately, you're putting some meat on the bones of the intervention. So you're describing what it is, where it will be delivered from, or when, but also alignment to existing strategies and answering very much the so what question. How much will it cost? How will it be funded? Are there procurement considerations? All of these sort of early stage technical issues, which will help you to develop a tangible proposition and one that people can understand, but also give you early sights of the things that will need to be addressed during the business case process. And importantly, what are the intended benefits and so on. So you're not necessarily looking for all the answers when you're developing a proposition, but you're developing this concept into a tangible proposal, which then it could be the subject of the business case. So important sort of pre-stages to get everyone mind pointing in the right direction, but also addressing some fundamental issues. And there may be some showstoppers in there, or it may be that actually, yes, these things can be addressed through time. So an early theory of change and a development of an initial proposition, we would advise and think are incredibly helpful moving forward. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I mean, so for instance, if we give you some examples, the councils that we've worked with before to help develop levelling up fund bids, which the levelling up fund bidding process is essentially a mini version of the Treasury 5-case model. The first step has always been that theory of change process, because you can imagine for a council that could do so much that the possibilities seem endless, and you've got to go through a process of narrowing it down and identifying, as Mark said, what specific challenges you're trying to address. And that theory of change process, which is usually across a couple of workshops right at the start, is a really good way of bringing people together. And as Mark says, getting everybody on the same page and understanding exactly what problems they're trying to solve and what some of the propositions are. And the good news is that actually that process develops a lot of the content for the first case, which is the strategic case. So the strategic case is very largely based around that theory of change. It's about explaining that change is needed, and I would describe it as needing to be a compelling narrative supported by evidence. So you've got to be really clear about what problem you're trying to solve. What is the problem? What is the challenge that you're trying to solve? Why can't you do what you want to do? What's the need? And really important to support that with evidence, because everybody can claim a problem exists or a challenge exists, but if you can evidence it as well, then that starts you in a really strong position where it can be undeniable that there is a problem, there is a challenge, and here is the evidence, and here's why whatever we're doing at the minute isn't working. Then you need to think about what your aim or strategic objectives are, and if you reflect back on how Mark described the theory of change, it's that far side where you think about what outcomes you're actually trying to achieve. So, a business case is really important. You've got to start with the end in mind and what you're trying to to achieve. So being really clear about the problem, being really clear about what outcome you're trying to achieve. Then, particularly when you're bidding for public money, it's important to try and link this whole endeavor with wider strategic objectives. Now, that might be at a national level, so lots of stuff around net zero, for instance, you can point to if that's part of what you're proposing, or there might be local things to do with reinventing the town centre, reinventing the high street, trying to drive the vibrancy of a local area. You know, that probably plays, or that probably is referenced within wider council strategies. So if your business case can show that it's linked to wider objectives, then that makes it really powerful as well. And then, as Mark said, at this point, this is where you introduce what your actual proposition is. So what are you proposing? You've got these challenges, you've got this ultimate outcome. What are you proposing that actually will achieve this? And can you describe how it will do it? Because if you can't put it in words, then it's probably not very strong. So you need to be able to actually describe it. Then you need to go into a bit more granular detail as to who exactly will benefit from this, and will anybody benefit. So you've got to be really clear about that. So this is to benefit this group of people, these people, this area, the economy, net zero, whatever it is. Be really clear about who will benefit from it. And then when Paul talks about the economic case, that's where you take that and really drill down into, right, what's the level of that benefit? Can you monetize that? Can you put numbers against that? Then also within the strategic case, you need to start to introduce some of the risks, constraints, dependencies. This is usually the first, well, this is almost always the first case that people read. So if there are big questions which this business case is proposing to answer, then you need to refer to them upfront in this case, because this is where you need to capture people's imagination and win the hearts. I would say that, you know, strategic case is often about winning hearts, and the other cases are then, right, okay, well, I think it's a good thing to do, but the other cases are then about, you know, the mind, and logically, is this a good thing to do as well? So I hope that makes sense. So Mark introduced that first step of doing a theory of change, developing propositions, your first formal bit of the business case is that strategic case where you take a lot of that and you flesh it out. So at this point, we have a really compelling case that there needs to be a change, and we've described what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve, and we demonstrated that the proposition we're proposing, we believe will address that. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now, who will talk us through the next two cases, which are the economic case and the financial case.
Thank you, Andrew. So the primary purpose of the economic case is to demonstrate a compelling value for money case for the overall proposition or propositions. So this is sort of linked into two key parts. First bit is the option appraisal and why the things you're choosing are the best things to do in this case. And then the second is to sort of calculate the actual value for money, or the ratio of the benefits to the costs of those things that you've taken forward. So looking at those in turn, in the options appraisal, there's generally two steps in this. The first is to discount any, sort of produce a long list of options that you've been through, possibly through the theory of change exercise, and explain why some of those have been excluded generally there because key constraints have been missed. So for shared prosperity fund, that might be because they can't be delivered in the timescales needed to achieve the funding. It might be that the mix of revenue and capital is wrong. It might be that there are key stakeholders that are totally opposed to certain things. It just doesn't deliver on the agenda, or it doesn't actually meet the requirements of the funder. So sort of to take out those things that really aren't applicable. And then the things that are left to sort of do a short list and say why the things you have chosen are the best. Now, again, there are different ways you can do this depending on the amount of work that's been done beforehand. So, for example, if you've done the overall program and submitted that, you may have a good idea of what things you want to take forward. But really, the purpose of this is to explain to anyone why you are doing the things you're doing and why you're not doing the things you're not. So what we often do is a very quick sort of work with stakeholders to say, what are the important things from the theory of change, how the various options could meet those, and weight how well each option delivers those and how important each of those things are from the theory of change. And that has two things. It sort of reinforces the things you're doing are the right things, and also it makes sure that the things in the theory of change that you said are important fully capture everything that you are important to you, and there's no bits that you say, actually, there's something that we're relying on, you know, we really want to regenerate the area, but we haven't got that in our theory of change. So it works both ways. So that's the sort of, and then you get to your preferred option. And then you sort of calculate the benefits and the costs associated with that particular option. So the first stage of that is to work through what are the actual benefits that you can quantify. And again, linking that back to the theory of change to say, these are the key measures that we think that this thing will help deliver for the local area. Then sort of finding the right models and methodologies to say, so we know that there's going to be an increase in tourism. So what is a good way to say what the value of that is to the local economy? You know, what research are we relying on? How long are we expecting those benefits to last? Is it just during the intervention? Is it 10 years after? Is it 25? So having rationales for all of those things and the amount that you hope that they will improve by. Now, in the Shared Prosperity Fund, some of the indicators that are used for outputs to government can be directly taken and used. So, for example, if you've got the number of trees planted, you can turn that into a quantified benefit. If you know how many people are attending training sessions, you can sort of multiply that up by some research that the government relies upon to say this is the welfare benefits from those people attending that training. And other ones will need some adjustment to take from an output to something that can actually be quantified. So, for example, one of the Shared Prosperity Fund indicators is sort of the number of volunteering opportunities. Now, to turn that into something that's of value, you probably need to say how many hours of volunteering are we have there, and we can sort of times that by the Heritage Lottery Fund standard sort of £10 per hour, £20 per hour, £50 per hour, depending on the level of skills, to get to a quantified benefit. So once we've sort of defined what things we're measuring, what way we are multiplying those up and what research we're relying on to get to a value, then we have to do some adjustments to that. So the idea is to sort of, the government in the Green Book talks about additionality adjustments, and they are about saying what would have happened even if we didn't intervene. So would we have invested some money ourselves? Might be industries in the area have done some stuff that we're stopping and crowding out the market, and would some things have just happened naturally? Would there have been some increase anyway to prosperity based upon what had happened in the area over time? So we have to make some adjustments for those, and there's some standard numbers that we use for that. And then there's some, we also sort of try to take out inflation and say benefits now are slightly more valuable than benefits into the future. So we try to compare everything on a like-for-like basis and work on the basis that a pound in the hand now is worth more than a pound 5 or 10 years into the future. So that gets you to a position of trying to quantify all the benefits. Then you do a similar thing with the costs. So you look at the total cost of the scheme. Again, you try to remove, for this case, all inflation, but you may want to build it in something that the government refers to as a risk factor or optimism bias. So that's generally saying, historically, over the whole of the public sector and industry in general, often we underestimate costs and overestimate benefits. So that's a way of just putting something back in. And generally, the more through a process you've got, the less risky it is, and the more close to what you are estimating would be the benefit. So if you've got full cost estimates, it's going to be less risky than if you haven't yet gone out to market. Again, you do the same thing with those, take out, discount for future costs. So you push everything back to a price as of now. So you get to a single value for cost, a single value for benefit, divide those two and you get to a benefit cost ratio. Generally, anything where the benefits are double the cost is generally seen as a really strong value for money case. Anything below 1 is generally seen as relatively weak. But that doesn't show the whole picture of all the benefits. So we can then look at anything where we haven't been able to quantify the benefits. So some of the wider sort of non-financial benefits, to put a narrative in for those, explain what they are, what the benefits would be in a more narrative form. Then we pick on any key risks within that, both on the cost and the benefit side. So what if less people than we are expecting users of facilities? What impact will that have on the benefits we've calculated? Similarly, if the costs are more expensive than we were planning, how would we deal with those things? What would be the impact on that value for money assessment? So the overall idea is to show, and again, we can turn those into things that are modeled to give a sensitivity analysis to say if those risks manifest, what would be the impact on those scores? So that generally comes together to give you an overall picture of what the value for money is of the preferred proposition. And again, by default, when you are building in the impact of additionality, you are taking away what would happen anyway. So you're sort of comparing it against the do nothing almost implicitly.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. I've got a couple of questions which have come in here. So understand the technical story you're telling there, but in terms of the links between outputs, outcomes, and economic benefits, can you give a practical example just to bring it to life?
Yes. So I think a good example would be if you are looking for improvements to tourism in an area. You may know either the number or the percentage that you are expecting to increase, and you may have that as an input for your shared prosperity fund. What we would do is sort of look at, there's some national research from the tourism board that say this is the amount per area that is the benefit to that area of tourism. This is the number of days people are taking holidays in that area. Divide one by the other, so we get an amount per day of additional spend in an area, which we can then use as that basis to say, how many days do we think of extra tourism or extra visitors would there be? Times that up by that amount per day, so you get to a value. Again, you would say, actually, on average, maybe tourism has been increasing in that area for 3 or 4% every year for the last 5 years. So we go, well, that would happen naturally. So we need to take that bit off when we're calculating a benefit for this particular intervention. So we'd be going from a target for the shared prosperity fund that is an increase in tourism. We would be saying, what does that mean practically in terms of number of days? And then using that as a basis to say, okay, that benefit times, say, £75 per visitor day that is spent in the area gives you this much benefit as a quantified benefit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. And this next question really links into your next case, which is the financial case. And I guess this is probably a useful question to make that link. But there's the question is, what are the differences between costs used in the economic case and in the finance case? Because I think probably people listening to you there probably feel that you're not just, when you're talking about the economic case, it's not just the flat number, there's some kind of modeling over time on it, whereas in the finance case, it's probably just whatever it costs when it's being paid.
Yes, thanks. So I guess the main purpose of the economic case is to demonstrate the value for money for this thing. And the idea is to be able to compare different projects to try to get a sort of analysis of which ones are best value for money. The purpose of the finance case, which we'll come on to, is a sort of affordability locally for that. So for the finance case, we generally take all the costs as they are incurred, both upfront and over time, and look to make sure that that can be delivered within the funding available for the local area. The purpose with the economic case is to try to get to the starting point is, if you had to pay for everything up front in one go, what would you pay for it? So it ignores things like borrowing costs. It doesn't take any account of how things will be financed, and looks for what are the costs up front, what's the cost of the intervention, and then sort of says, actually, if things are further in the future, then we need to reduce those costs down. So it sort of gets rid of inflation, it discounts and takes away some money for things into the future. So I guess my old thing is, if anyone asks me, what did you pay for your house? I always say, well, I paid 150 grand. I don't say, actually, I took out a mortgage for that and I've ended up paying double that over 20 years. Yes, so yeah, that's the difference between the economic cases. What would you pay up front for it? Whereas the finance case actually says, can you afford to pay that over the 20 years you've got your mortgage?
So really, that last example there, I think will hit home with everybody there. So moving from the economic case, Paul, then into the finance case. So can you just say a bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks. So the overall purpose of third is about the affordability of this. So we generally look at the finance case across the initial, the upfront, or the costs associated with setting up and delivering the intervention, and then the ongoing, any changes to the ongoing revenue costs associated with that after you have finished it. So first bit is those capturing the initial costs, including all of the contingencies, any risk premiums you build into that, and then offsetting that to say, how are we funding that upfront thing? So what are our sources of income? How much are we getting from government, from the Shared Prosperity Fund? Are we borrowing any other elements? How are we funding it? Are there any match funding? So showing sort of how those things offset. Then looking at the longer term, and that's the revenue cost to say, depending on how we are funding any elements that aren't coming from grant, are there borrowing costs? Do we have to factor that in? Are there changes to maintenance costs? Are there any costs that will carry on afterwards? So if we're employing staff, do we have to break the service and pay anything off afterwards? Or are we intending to carry that on? Are we generating extra income? Are we reducing our maintenance costs because of the investment we've done in our building? So sort of setting out that wider sort of the cash flow associated with any intervention over time. And similar again to the economic case, this one's a bit more simple. You'd be looking at what are the key risks associated with that. So what happens if one of our funding sources that we're relying on doesn't come through? For example, if we're looking for lottery funding to match fund an element and that doesn't come through, what will we do to adjust for that? Similarly, what happens actually if staff costs rise over time? We built 5 in, so looking at both the capital and the one-off and the ongoing costs and any income associated with it. So if we are generating income through rent or something, what happens if rent changes either more or less? And again, running some sensitivity and impact analysis on those key risks. So to say, and overall, what we're trying to show is under a range of things that could happen as an organisation, as a place, we can afford that thing. So we've got the confidence that we can deliver under a range of potential circumstances. So again, looking at those key things, running some sensitivities to say what happens if.
Yeah.
That's
very clear. I mean, I think it should be the finance case is probably a bit more familiar for people in terms of day-to-day running of things. So I've got a question here which actually refers back to the economic case that I want to just put to you now. So this is one which has just come in. So would you include negative land value uplift in the BCR? For instance, demolishing a building in order to create public realm. The public realm land is always going to be worth less than the value of the building being demolished.
So I think it's you should always look at both the costs and the benefits and try to come to the net position. So where you would look at is certainly trying to show the wider concept. So I guess you'd also have to look at both the benefit, the cost, direct cost. So yes, put that as a negative benefit or a cost associated with it, but also look at what impact that would have and why you are doing it. So would that over time help to increase the surrounding land value of that land? So as long as you cover all of those things and you say, well, there may be a direct upfront cost, but that is shown by a longer term benefit, not necessarily just to that place, but actually the surrounding area, and you quantify that benefit alongside, then you're doing it in a consistent manner. So I would say, yes.
Well, this has always struck me as much of an art as a science. Would that be fair?
Yes, I think there are different ways that you can measure the same thing, and there are also different ways you can package these things up. I think the key thing, is always to be really clear from the theory of change, have this thread, if you like, to say, these are the things we're trying to achieve. These are why they are important. This is how we are measuring those things. And this is why we are measuring these things. And I guess there's always a kind of a league table of different ways you could measure the same things. And what's important is you justify the reason you're doing it, the evidence that you've got, and making sure that what you aren't doing is counting the same benefit in 3 different ways. So you don't generally say, well, we're going to increase the value of the property and the underlying land, and we're going to create jobs, which is fundamental to the regeneration of the wider land value, and we count all of those things at once, because generally they're counting the same thing 3 different ways, and that's where I think you get into trouble.
No, I think that's exactly right. And whilst there are different approaches that you can use, it's certainly not the case that you can just approach it whatever way you want, because that will not pass muster. There will be some tests to go through here. So Paul, many thanks for those fantastic explanations. So in our business case journey, we've made the case for change in the strategic case. We've looked at the numbers. So we've proven, hopefully at this point, that it will create value for money. And we've shown that it's affordable over the period of time where it will take to actually implement it. So now we need to get into the practicalities of it, which is where the commercial case and the management case comes in. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. So the commercial case, ultimately, the commercial case is there to demonstrate that what's being proposed is both commercially attractive and commercially viable. So if we just take the attractive concept first. So ultimately, through the strategic case, through the financial and the economic case, we're portraying a case where there is demand for what we're proposing to deliver. So, for example, if it's a service, that there are service users that will engage with that service. Equally, if there's an asset, so if this is the building of a leisure and wellbeing hub or community hub or whatever it is, that there is demand, there is a need for the proposition. So in terms of assessing the attractiveness, it's demonstrating that demand for the service or the asset, being able to point very clearly to evidence of unmet need, and also considering whether this access will be on a universal free basis or whether there'll be a charging model, and understanding at what level prices would be set, for example, and ensuring affordability from that perspective. So there's an attractive consideration to recipients of the asset or the service, but also there's an attractive consideration from the market perspective. And this is very much around the readiness of the market to deliver. If you are proposing to procure something, it's worth certainly being able to demonstrate that the market is ready, it's able and equipped to be able to deliver what you're intending to procure. So examples there of evidence would be market engagement by the council to test the market, to engage in dialogue with providers or the market in general, to really understand and identify the ability of the market to deliver on that and how attractive your proposal would be to the market to deliver. So this is really important considerations. What you don't want to do is go out, start implementing what's been proposed in the business case and find that from a sort of market perspective, the procurement that you were proposing, for whatever reason, isn't attractive. Obviously, there are challenges supply side in terms of availability, particularly around construction at the moment. So the more detail you have in the commercial case about market engagement or demonstrating an understanding of the market, the better, because this is about managing commercial risk, and primarily procurement is one of the largest risks associated with any intervention. So a deep dive in terms of the characteristics of the market's ability to deliver, and any considerations that would then influence your procurement strategy are critical in that respect. So that's the attractiveness element. Then you go to the viability aspect of it. So Paul's already mentioned, and this is how the commercial case talks to the financial and the economic cases. The second element of the commercial case is the nature of the deal. So identifying the sort of key contractual terms that will underpin the funding model for your proposal in your business case. So there may be a blend of funding, whether it's grant funding from various sources, whether there's match funding, whether there's sort of additionality from a private sector perspective. Understanding where the funding is coming from is critical. Understanding the terms on which that funding is being allocated are also critical. So if we go through the Levelling Up Fund, that has criteria about what it can be spent on, when it can be spent by. Similarly, UK Share Prosperity Fund has caveats associated with it. So it's about understanding the nature of the funding sources. From a match funding perspective, how secure that is, whether it's secured, unsecured, what the risks are if unsecured match funding isn't secured, and having these contingency plans in place. Contingency plans ultimately meaning other sources of information, other sources of funding, which may be available to offset any shortfall in what was anticipated, but also potential contingencies around rises in inflation, for example, that make that impact significantly on the cost base. So from a procurement strategy, I think that there's critical aspects to this as well from a viability perspective, understanding what you're buying or proposing to buy in terms of costs, timescales for delivery and so on, and being very clear about what the risks are associated with those, but also being quite creative and sort of going into Paul's world of the economic analysis, what your specification in your tender would be considering from a benefits perspective, how you embed some of those benefits that are required within your contracts with your supply chains. So examples would be social value requirements around the use of local supply chains, the creation of apprenticeships or gateways into employment, and sort of being very clear about the contractual terms that you will be taking to the market and how those contractual terms will benefit you and your organisation in terms of the benefits that will be realised. So there's critical considerations, and there are absolutely links in back to the economic case and the financial case. The commercial case, there's also some wider considerations. Inflation has come up a few times, so key considerations and contingencies there around inflation, and also other cost management considerations, having a strong understanding of what the market is able to provide, and contingency arrangements should there be any shocks to those markets. And Paul's mentioned some scenario and sensitivity testing, which would talk to one section talking to another again. Subsidy control should be considered, legal advice on any public funds, just to ensure that there isn't a subsidy control issue, and if doing the necessaries there. Also, this is ultimately public funds, so public sector equality duties need to be considered during this stage, and any implications or cost or commercial issues identified at that point. Other issues include data protection, for example. But ultimately, what you're trying to do through the commercial case is identify the attractiveness and the viability of what's being proposed. And as a result of that, identify the commercial risks and mitigations associated with that. So there will be liabilities, there will be risks here. And making sure we're fully aware of those before we actually press the button and start delivering, because there are these liabilities and these risks that need to be understood and addressed as we move forward.
Fantastic. Mark, I just want to do a tiny bit of jargon busting. You talked about supply side, just so that everybody understands what that means. That's the suppliers that you need to bring in to support you to... That's
correct, yeah. That's your supply chain, which the market would provide over time.
So it could be contractors, it could be architects, it's all of that.
Yeah, it could also service providers. You know, if we're talking about a revenue budget here, so it's a service, it would be that market for service providers.
Yeah, and you also mentioned subsidy control. Now, anybody watching this who had to put in a levelling up bid will know all about subsidy control, but just for those who maybe don't, what does that mean?
Oh, I'm pleased you asked me that one, Andrew.
No,
So,
make it short, make it short.
So it's, I mean, the old state aid, ultimately this is about distortion of the market and making sure that public funds aren't creating a distorted market and an uneven playing field. So some level of public subsidy is fine, but the thinking and the investigation needs to be had to say, is it a subsidy? And if so, what are the impacts of that subsidy? And the subsidy control regime is a new regime post-Brexit, which creates a step-by-step process for public authorities to investigate the nature of the subsidy, whether it will impact on distort markets, and if so, what action needs to be taken.
Great, thank you very much. You also mentioned inflation and factoring in inflation. Really easy to say, but a business case that developed a year ago probably didn't predict what's happened. What are people doing, or what are organizations doing to deal with the huge changes in inflation?
Yeah, so maybe I can answer that from a practical perspective and Paul from a sort of financial controls perspective. If we just take levelling up fund bids, so they were submitted in August last year. Since then, there's been particularly around construction, there's been a significant increase in inflation, which is impacting budgets. So I think it's important to go back to the bid and understand what contingency was made for inflation, both at a sort of line by line budget code level and any overall contingency which has been allocated in the original bid, and then work out what the new costs are and see if one equals the other. If new costs exceed the old costs and therefore there is a budgetary shortfall, I mean, some of my clients we're doing that work at the moment. There are opportunities around reviewing the specification in terms of what would be constructed, the scale and the scope of what's being proposed, and finding a new balance in terms of what's affordable and what's viable. That can't be done in isolation, and obviously that needs to be done in conversation with the central government, who are ultimately delivering on, who are providing this funding. It's a tricky one, but I suppose in summary, finding out if there is a problem, and if so, how big that problem is, that's time very well spent.
That's the first step, isn't it, where you've got to actually look at it. Paul, is there anything you want to add from a financial controls perspective?
I think Mark's covered all of it, really. It's ultimately you've got contingency, and then it's down to the triangle of scope, time, quality, cost. Something has to move, and it's about talking to everyone and getting everyone comfortable with it. Something
has to give, I think, is the message. There isn't any financial wizardry that can make you be able to do what you had proposed if everything is increased in cost, for sure. Yeah. Mark, can I get you to turn your attention to the management case now, which is the final of our 5 cases?
Sure, thanks, Andrew. So the management case, this is, I think, usually a strength of local authorities in terms of, demonstrating the how, and the management case very much is about how this will be delivered, but through, implementing the business case, sorry. So what you would expect to see, the core ingredients of a management case: a project plan that demonstrates the key stages, the actions, the responsibilities, the timescales and the dependencies associated with the proposal. Clear expenditure profiling to know that links up with your delivery plan. So if we're delivering this in February, we can expect the expenditure to be incurred at that point in time. So that's really important. The design and then implementation of clear project management and program management arrangements and resourcing, and also project monitoring. All these processes are key and critical and should be demonstrated within the management case. A really important part is around mitigation of risks and issues. So we talked about lots of risks and issues throughout the business case. It's about how those will be managed on a day-to-day basis. Clearly identifying tolerances within the business case. So if we're saying, going back to your example of inflation, Andrew, we've got a set budget here, a cost for a particular asset or service, but if inflation is pushing that up, at what point does that really become a problem? Is it 5% increase, 10%, 20%? And having tolerances in place, which will help you to monitor that and flag where there are issues, is critical. equally so is the escalation route. So we have a problem, what happens, who needs to know and who needs to decide, and then outlining your governance structures to make sure that from a oversight and scrutiny perspective, that there are the necessary checks and balances here, but also on an operational level, there is the sufficient governance and project management support to be able to deliver what needs to be delivered. And then often specialist advice is required. So it's helpful in the management case to identify what that is, when that will be, and what the costs are. And that will obviously feed through to the financial case. And ultimately, this is about transformation and improving on what we currently have. So benefit realization plans, how we're going to demonstrate the benefits, who's collecting the information, what does good look like, that's critical. And then finally, evaluation arrangements. So those of you involved in the Levelling Up Fund will be aware of the need to evaluate the impact of your interventions, your projects. That's on a local level, so on a project by project basis, but there's also a requirement for each grant council receiving LUF funding, for example, to contribute to a nationwide evaluation which central government will be running. And that's a very similar story to UK Shared Prosperity Fund as well, where there's local evaluations that feed up to a national evaluation. So all of this in the management case needs to be thought through. The concept is clear, this needs to happen. The management case is very much about how is it going to happen, when's it going to happen, and who's going to lead on that process.
Fantastic, thanks, Mark. And a very practical question here, which has come in, and I'm guessing this is somebody listening to all of this and who potentially has responsibility for developing a business case and is thinking, how can I cover all this stuff? Would you suggest that it's best for one person to take responsibility for the development of a business case, or is it more of a team effort? Or does it depend?
Yeah, it depends, I think. So I think there's different ways of doing this. Where I've seen this work best is where you can point to one person or a small number of people who are in ownership of the business case, are overseeing how it's being developed, when it's being developed, and who's it's being developed by. But ultimately, I think leads for the individual sections of the business case is not a bad idea. However, that coordination is really important.
Someone has to grip it. Someone has to grip it and be accountable for it.
What you need, exactly, but also what you need to try and avoid is each case being developed in isolation. So I've worked with Paul on many business cases with colleagues, and the challenge is as much the coordination and telling the same story from different angles in the various cases as gathering the information in the first place. So coordination is critical, but these are generally, it's a big ask. So, I wouldn't expect one person to be holding the pen on everything and really driving it forward. Also, that sort of diversity of thought is really helpful. So having a couple of, more than say 2 people on a business case allows for challenge and allows for scrutiny in a way that one person holding it would be really challenging. And also, just the stuff that Paul's outlined today, the economic bit is quite unique and requires a skill set that, it's good to have specialists for each of the cases, I would argue, but the coordination is absolutely critical.
Fantastic, thanks, Mark. So we got one more question here which has come in, which is a very practical application of this. So I would say a lot of people on the call will be aware of the Levelling Up Fund bidding process. So we've had 2 rounds so far. In the last round, round 2, only 1 out of 5 bids were successful. So there's been a round 3 announced, and our expectation is that a lot of the unsuccessful bids from round 2 will reapply for round 3. So question here is, based on our experience and feedback we've seen from LUF in round 2, what should we be thinking about? Now, bearing in mind the link to business cases here is that the LUF application bidding process is the same structure, more or less, as a Treasury 5-case model. So it is very much linked to this. But what advice can we give people who are looking at resubmitting for round 3?
Shall I start and Mark join in afterwards?
Please.
I think where the feedback so far has been that the government has really liked it when there is a clear link throughout the thing with the theory of change, so that linking the problems to solutions to your economic benefits is something where when it's done well, the government sort of seems really pleased with. we also know from a practical, from the economic case, the government is very keen on using increased land values as a key economic benefit, and this needs local information sort of fairly early in the process. So if you are submitting a round 3-1, think about getting some professional advice about current land values and what area and the surrounding area could be uplifted by, based upon your regeneration efforts and your interventions, because that needs to be done locally. I think the government is very keen on sticking to its standard appraisal period, so 30 years for a refurbishment, 60 years for something that's new built. And even though they didn't ask specifically in the questions, I think they're really keen on sensitivity analysis on benefits. So that from an economic case, I think they're the key things.
Great. Thank you. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's slightly difficult, this, because we know there will be a round 3, but we don't know what it will look like. It could just be a simple rerun of round 2 in terms of the framework, the criteria, all of everything's the same. You just need to take the feedback on board and resubmit. But it could be slightly different in terms of, it's a smaller pot.
It could be different in terms of focus areas as well.
Exactly. So every unsuccessful council will have received their feedback. That's certainly worth having a look at and seeing what improvements can be made feasibly to the round 2 bid. But I think it's difficult to know until the framework of the levelling up round 3 has been confirmed. And I'd urge, caution in terms of potentially spending more than councils already have in terms of moving this forward very quickly. I think there'll be a point where there's clarity in terms of the framework. Stuff that unsuccessful round 2s could do now if they wanted to resubmit in the round 3. Certainly make sure that the theory of change is as robust as it can be, making sure that the propositions are well defined and developed further if there are any gaps that were identified in the feedback, and improve readiness without actually pressing the button, because we don't know. It could be exactly the same round 3, or there could be subtle differences. We don't know. So it's just that sort of fine balancing act at the moment, I think.
Yeah, great. And then we've got one more question here, which I'm just going to squeeze in before the end. Paul, this might be one for you initially. What are your views on balancing the need for detail and certainty versus exposure to costs before the funding is secured? So particularly where a project requires construction, there are a lot of risks and unknowns until you get to pre-contract and push the button to go ahead.
I think this really comes down to how much your local governance is comfortable with that associated risk. So generally, especially for shared prosperity, what you would want to do is make sure there is sufficient so that all your stakeholders are in line in supporting a bid and for saying to government, we are prepared to accept this money on the basis of the current position. So there are lots of different ways that you can do that and different risks. So generally, what we would see from an economic case is the more certainty there is in cost, generally the less extra percentage you have to add on to those costs in the basis of risk. So generally that pushes up the value for money, but there is a cost associated with developing all that extra information. But ultimately it is always a balance, and that balance is going to be dependent upon both your local appetite to risk, the amount the politicians are prepared to sign off on while things are still uncertain, and what is needed to secure other funding from other places. So you may be dependent upon lottery funding that needs a certain level of detail in your business case. So I hate to say it depends, but it kind of depends on a lot of factors, risk appetite, costs, how big it is, and what you need from everyone. But ultimately, you do whatever is needed to get it over the line with the level of detail needed to get over each line as you get to it, I would say.
I mean, this is very much to the point of it being as much an art as a science as well. And, I think a lot of what Paul was talking about there are to do with relationships and to do with trust and levels of confidence. And that's partly based on a spreadsheet, but also partly based on the decision makers having confidence in the people who are putting the business case together. Yeah, Paul.
Just say add that the other thing, feel almost obliged to say this, that the business case should be a living document. And the idea is you build it at the start with a certain level of detail, certain level of risk, and then you refine it over time. So as if it's approved on these are the unknowns at the moment, you carry on and you take back to the decision makers or your own internal governance processes at various times, say, okay, we've now procured those things, so these costs have crystallized, we've got a contract for these, this is the impact, we relook at it then. If things go outside tolerances, you go back to the various people to say things have changed. If everything can be constrained, then those things can just carry on. And again, that's where all the bits interface within each other, because the management case will set out what those governance processes are and when you need to escalate them.
Thank you. Mark, any last word from you?
I think it's the right question to ask, really, because, you know, across Levelling Up Fund and Shared Prosperity, ultimately there's a contractual term, which is this is the amount we're giving to each council, and that's your lot. So the cost increase, the liability sits solely with the council. So in terms of cost management and management of risks, you know, it's absolutely the right thing to focus on, because there is a lot of risk there.
Excellent. So Mark, Paul, thank you so much for your time. So for people listening, this is being recorded and we will send that out along with our guide to business case development. If you want to have an informal conversation about what you're doing locally, whether you have business cases to develop or are just interested in a bit more detail, then please do get in touch. You can get me at andrew@mutualventures.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear what's going on in local areas. So with that, I will say goodbye to everyone.